In the dying days of October 1963, the Kennedy administration agonized over a planned coup in Saigon. This is the violent story of that coup, the overthrow and murder of President Diem, and how senior members of the United States government believed the coup they were responsible for would lead to disaster in South Vietnam. This channel's mission is to challenge the Vietnam orthodoxy through reference to primary sources. Much of what you know about the Vietnam War is either incomplete or false. Please consider supporting this channel and its mission through Patreon. The link is in the description. Following the failed coup in August, the American government remained divided. Harriman, Hillsman, Forrestal and Ball continued to oppose Diem, while those who opposed his removal included Secretary of Defense McNamara, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Taylor, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, CIA Director McCone, former Ambassador Nolting, CIA Far East Division Director William Colby, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson. This group believed dissatisfaction with Diem's handling of the Buddhist crisis was largely limited to the cities, that it was driven by inaccurate press articles, and that it was largely a consequence of the failure to quickly crack down on the protests. It was also noted that Diem's popularity in the countryside was rising due to the military successes against the Viet Cong. President Kennedy had not sided firmly with either side. The misreporting of the Buddhist protests had eroded public support for his Vietnam policy, falling to 28%, while 56% opposed it. And in a televised interview with Walter Cronkite, Kennedy was critical of Diem's handling of the crisis and suggested that changes in policy and personnel would be required to win the war. In early September, Kennedy dispatched US Marine Corps General Victor Krulak, selected by McNamara, and State Department pick Joseph Mendenhall to Vietnam. Krulak talked to US advisors and South Vietnamese officers across the four core areas, who confirmed that the war was going well and that the South Vietnamese officers had expressed no desire to replace Diem. In September, for example, the ARVN 7th Division inflicted heavy losses on the Viet Cong 261st and 514th Battalions, the two battalions that had defeated the division at Bac. The Viet Cong intensified the attacks on the strategic hamlets in the Mekong Delta in late summer, targeting four provinces: Long An, Dinh Tuong, Vinh Binh, and Quyen Hoa. The Delta's long coastline and extensive waterways created favourable infiltration and supply routes from North Vietnam and Cambodia, and the Communists succeeded in overrunning a significant number of strategic hamlets in Long An and Dinh Tuong. However, the Communist leadership in South Vietnam confirmed the advances made by the strategic hamlet program. The enemy is still pushing his program forward into our areas. Mendenhall, a long-standing critic of Diem, spent his time in three South Vietnamese cities, speaking primarily to American and South Vietnamese officials. In his presentation, Mendenhall warned that if Nhu was not removed from power, South Vietnam would fall to either the Viet Cong or to a religious civil war. He neglected to include two important conclusions from his written report. The military leadership and the provincial and district chiefs had not turned against Diem, and discipline in the lower ranks had not declined. CIA Director McCone opposed Mendenhall's position, stating that the Vietnamese military officers will work with Nhu. At the beginning of September, Nhu informed the Americans that he would distance himself from the government if the US would withdraw agents dealing with potential traitors. He also promised that Buddhist prisoners would be released and that Madame Nhu would leave the country, which she did several days later. But rather than use these developments to work amicably with Diem and Nhu to resolve the remaining problems, instead Lodge threatened Diem with the removal of aid if Nhu did not leave the country and if policy did not change. And confronted with a situation where he might lose face, Diem defended his brother. He also observed that if American opinion is in the state you describe, then it is up to you to disintoxicate American opinion. Lodge had initially followed the administration's approach after the abortive coup in August, advocating a limit on New's role, and the appointment of Tuan as Prime Minister. But frustrated in his conversation with Diem, he now advocated a coup, and on September 11th, he cabled the State Department. The time has arrived for the United States to use what effective sanctions it has to bring about the fall of the existing government and the installation of another. Lodge was instead told to continue talking with Diem, but he secretly explored the possibility of starting a coup on his own. His plans were thwarted, however, by McCone on the 13th, when, based on a report from a CIA officer, he revealed to Kennedy that Lodge was considering a coup in cooperation with General Don. The South Vietnamese generals were less enthusiastic about a coup than Lodge, and asked Diem for important cabinet posts. Diem replied that the generals would have to wait until after the national elections on September 27th. From September, Lodge relied on US newspaper correspondence for information, rather than the assessments of the American military and CIA, and while he accepted that the military situation was improving, he shared the opinion of the press that the situation was sure to deteriorate unless Diem was removed. General Hawkins and CIA Station Chief Richardson reported that the generals were still willing to work with Diem despite their recent plotting, while also remarking on the improving military situation. Lodge was irritated by Richardson's support for Diem, and on September 13th he requested his removal in a message to Dean Rusk, a request which was declined by McCone. Halberstam, writing for the New York Times, and Richard Starnes for Scripps Howard, an American newspaper chain, wrote articles critical of the CIA on September 15th and at the start of October respectively, and Starnes also made Richardson's name public. James Reston of the New York Times told McCone that the stories were obvious plants, with Harriman a likely source. Richardson was then abruptly removed, whether on Lodge's prompting or because of his exposure as CIA station chief. Kennedy was increasingly frustrated with the reporting of Halberstam, and when Joseph Olson, the most influential media figure of the day, reported that there is something oddly inconsistent here with the widely propagated picture of Vietnamese masses with no will to resist, and a positive tendency to regard the communists as the preferable alternative. Kennedy asked the CIA for a detailed study on Halberstam's reporting. The CIA report stated that Halberstam was not quoting American military sources that were positive about the course of the war, and that a great amount of evidence contradicted Halberstam's reporting with regard to the Buddhist crisis. Their conclusion was that Halberstam was misrepresenting the news. Kennedy was also suspicious of the opinions of Lodge and the State Department officials opposed to Diem. In late September, he sent McNamara and Taylor to Vietnam to assess the situation. Arriving on September 24th for a 10-day visit, McNamara and Taylor met with people of varying opinions. US military officers were optimistic about the military situation, while embassy officials believed the government was in political crisis. In a private meeting with McNamara and Taylor at a tennis club, General Min complained about the organisation of the military and favouritism of Catholics over Buddhists, but stated that there was no alternative to Diem that could gain domestic and foreign support. And in a comment that would gain great importance later, he also remarked that it would be tragic to retard the military campaign by a cutback in aid. At a 3-hour meeting with Diem on September 29th, McNamara and Taylor, accompanied by Lodge, listened for 2 hours while the president spoke about progress in the war. McNamara responded by relaying Kennedy's concern for the support of the South Vietnamese government in the US and South Vietnam. On October 2nd, McNamara and Taylor presented their report to Kennedy. The war was going well enough that the US could withdraw 1,000 advisors by the end of the year, and the political situation would not harm the war effort, at least in the short term. McNamara went on to propose that the US cut enough aid to put pressure on Diem to institute reforms he thought necessary, while not endangering the war effort. He also proposed that Diem be given 2 to 4 months to comply, and if he did not, a coup to remove him should be considered. Kennedy made these recommendations policy and ordered a cut in aid, directing Lodge to conduct covert efforts to identify and build contacts with possible alternatives to Diem, while not giving active encouragement to a coup. But the cut in aid had unintended consequences. It reduced Diem's prestige, while making him less rather than more cooperative. And while he released more Buddhist prisoners, he rejected the political reforms demanded. Austerity measures, combined with a cut in aid, also created economic difficulties which further eroded confidence in the government. And crucially, it convinced the senior military leadership in South Vietnam that the country would lose American support if Diem remained in power. On October 5th, General Min asked Conin for assurances the US government would not block a coup he was planning with Don, Kim and Kiem, and that after the coup it would continue providing aid to South Vietnam. Lodge seized the opportunity to advance the situation more quickly than had been planned, and he immediately cabled Kennedy requesting authorization to give Min the desired assurances. The president replied on October 5th, repeating the earlier command not to give active encouragement to a coup while building contacts with possible alternatives to Diem. He added that the US position was that while it didn't wish to encourage a coup, it didn't want to give the impression that it would block one, or deny economic or military aid to a new government which would increase popular support and the effectiveness of the war effort. Kennedy also suggested that detailed information should be requested, as the information so far provided did not indicate a high prospect of success for Min's plans. Lodge did not convey the full message to Min. Instead, on October 10th, he had Conin inform the generals that the US would not block a coup that appeared capable of increasing the military effort and popular support for the war. General Min would later state that the final consideration that encouraged all of us to go ahead was the knowledge of the disenchantment of the US with Diem's government, and that the revolutionary government would probably be quickly recognized and supported. The military situation continued to progress in Saigon's favor. In Chong Chien province, the Arvin 21st Division advanced through water and mud up to their hips, maneuvering across open rice paddies towards the village of Bai Ai, which was defended by heavy machine guns and interlocking fields of fire. The Arvin moved to surround the village, but worsening weather grounded further helicopter flights, and after dark the Viet Cong slipped away, leaving behind 82 bodies, to 41 dead and 83 wounded Arvin soldiers. In contrast to a similar situation at Bak, the American advisors were not critical of the Arvin effort, and in the New York Times, even Halberstam recognized the courage and determination of these South Vietnamese soldiers. The war was going well across the country. Government forces in the Mekong Delta killed 159 VC for little loss to themselves in 2 engagements, and in Binh Dinh province, the South Vietnamese ambushed elements of the Viet Cong 32nd Main Force Battalion, themselves planning to ambush a government relief force responding to an attack on An Tuong village. The 60th and 70th VC battalions were found near the junction of Han and Chan rivers, and after several days of clashes, 32 VC were killed, 17 captured, and 7 tons of rice were seized. Furthermore, the strategic Hamlet program was progressing well. At a party at the British Embassy on October 22nd, Hawkins told General Don that a Vietnamese colonel had asked an American officer if the US would support a coup involving Min and other generals. He went on to tell Don that since the war was going well, he could not support a coup. Don pretended ignorance of the plot and hurried from the party, reporting Hawkins' comments to the other generals. The coup had been scheduled for October 26, when, under the cover of Armed Forces Day, the conspirators could move their forces into Saigon without raising suspicion, but this warning from Hawkins, combined with reports that Diem had learned a coup was imminent, convinced them to delay their action. General Don then met with Conin, who assured him that Hawkins' views did not represent those of the American government, and the next day Don notified Conin that the coup would take place before November 2nd. Lodge, concerned that Hawkins would inform Taylor of his conversation with General Don, then began to communicate details of the plotting to Kennedy. The White House was stunned at the imminent coup, and emerging evidence that Lodge had been conspiring with the generals. Kennedy had by this time realized he had made a mistake in appointing Lodge, but did not feel that he could remove him. The restrictions on his actions were then repeated to Lodge, but once again he chose to ignore the directions. Lodge met with Diem at the mountain resort town of Dalat on October 27th. Once more he pressed Diem to accept political reforms, but was resisted, as Diem defended his independence. On his way to the villa, Lodge had met with General Don at Tan Son Nhut Airport, giving his approval to prepare a coup. On October 29th, Kennedy met with his senior advisors to discuss the coup. Harriman and Rusk argued that the situation in South Vietnam would decline unless Diem was removed, but Robert Kennedy voiced the uncertainty of the administration when he remarked, "We're just going down the road to disaster." Taylor and McCone agreed. Taylor repeated the view that the South Vietnamese military was still committed to the war, and McCone made the point that an unsuccessful coup would be a disaster, but a successful coup would create a period of political confusion which might also be disastrous. When the meeting ended, McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, sent a message to Lodge instructing him to notify the generals that the US was not confident of the coup's success. Lodge, Hawkins and the CIA were to assess the chances of success, and a decision would then be made whether to encourage or discourage the coup, or whether a hands-off policy should be adopted. Lodge received the cable on the morning of October 30th and replied in the evening. He argued that the generals should not be informed of the opinion on the coup's chances, and in fact he never had Koenig pass on the message as he had been instructed by the President. The same day, Hawkins complained to Washington in 3 cables that Lodge was giving active encouragement to the plotters against official policy, and he was also failing to keep him informed about the plotting. Hawkins complained again that there was no one to replace Diem. "In my contacts here I have seen no one with the strength of character of Diem, at least in fighting communists." That night Kennedy sent another cable to Lodge, expressing his doubts about the coup, but he left the final decision on support for the coup in Lodge's hands. On October 31st, General Don asked Diem and knew about the request he and General Zinn had made in September for cabinet posts. Their request was denied, with the explanation that such changes were unnecessary given the improvement in the situation, and Don would later remark that this rejection led the generals to confirm the coup. On the morning of November 1st, the day of the coup, Diem met with Lodge and Admiral Felt, visiting Chief of US Pacific Command. Diem confided in them that he expected a coup to take place, but did not know who was behind it. He went on to ask Lodge to communicate to Kennedy his willingness to work with Washington and his desire to implement Kennedy's suggestions. In a cable to Washington, Lodge admitted that this conversation indicated a reconciliation with Diem was possible, but he dispatched it with the lowest possible priority, and it did not arrive until several hours after high-priority cables reporting the coup in Saigon were received. A short time before the coup began, Colonel Coup arrived at My To and the 7th Division. Coup took command of the division, the soldiers with him subduing the officers with their automatic weapons. He had not only neutralized a critical division which was loyal to Diem, but through the division he had ferries in the area moved to the north bank of the Mekong River, preventing reinforcement of forces loyal to Diem in Saigon. Many high-ranking officers were summoned to Joint General Staff Headquarters, including the commanders of the Airborne Brigade, the Marine Brigade, and the Special Forces, key units in Saigon. Uncertain whether these men were loyal to Diem, they were immediately arrested. Koenig was also present at the headquarters. He had arrived with a .38 revolver and a brown bag filled with money. The plotters had asked him to bring as much money with him as he could, and he arrived with $7,000 and a radio. If the coup failed, the plotters told him, the radio would be used to maintain contact with the CIA while they fought their way to sanctuary in Cambodia in 9 armoured cars. Koenig also established a secure telephone line to the US Embassy and provided information as the coup progressed. The coup began in Saigon at 1:45 in the afternoon. The headquarters of pro-Diem military units were attacked, by troops that believed they were going to rescue Ziem rather than overthrow him. The government's radio station was captured, and the rebels broadcast a message announcing the success of the coup before the Presidential Guard recaptured it. Other government headquarters were quickly overwhelmed. The Presidential Guard, Special Forces and Navy resisted, but other units, rendered ineffective by the earlier loss of their leaders, did not come to Ziem's aid. Several Special Forces companies had been sent from Saigon just before the coup, but a large number surrendered under the orders of Colonel Lê Quang Tung, a pistol held to his head as he spoke over the phone. His message delivered, the conspirators then executed him. Ziem and Niu were monitoring events from the basement of the presidential palace. At 3:30, Ziem spoke to General Don by telephone. Don demanded Ziem's resignation and offered to send Ziem and his family out of the country. Later in the afternoon, Don again demanded that Ziem resign and warned that if he did not, the palace would be blasted off the face of the earth. As the assault commenced, a Special Forces brigade commander suggested armour and infantry loyal to Ziem attack the lightly defended rebel headquarters. With the coup leaders in custody, he reasoned, their forces would capitulate. But Ziem refused to proceed with the plan, eager to avoid more bloodshed, and conscious of the damage to public confidence in the army that such an attack would provoke. Then at 4:30, Ziem telephoned Ambassador Lodge. He asked the view of the American government, but Lodge was evasive and denied knowledge of events. Lodge raised the offer of safe conduct out of the country, but Ziem responded only that he was trying to re-establish order. According to Frederick Flott, present with Lodge during the call, Lodge offered to send a car to collect Ziem and to transport him to the Philippines on a US jet. One of Ziem's bodyguards reported that he responded angrily to this suggestion and stated that the US government must take full responsibility before the world in this miserable matter. For several hours, Ziem and Niu attempted to bring reinforcements to Saigon. As many as half of the division commanders were loyal to Ziem, but their units could not reach Saigon because of rebel obstruction or lack of transport. The 9th Division was ordered to Saigon by the 4 Corps commander, Huyen Van Cao, but the division commander, Colonel Bui Zin, was frustrated in this movement, discovering that the ferries required to cross the Mekong had been moved. At 8 o'clock, Ziem and Niu left the palace through an underground tunnel, and were driven in a plain Citroën 2CV to the home of a prominent Chinese citizen in Cholon. An hour later, tanks and artillery began to attack the palace. The Presidential Guard fought desperately to hold their ground, and at 10 p.m, 400 infantrymen and 17 tanks of the Presidential Guard counterattacked the 1,000 rebel troops outside the palace. American and South Vietnamese civilians watched events unfold from rooftops as the two sides fought in the streets and alleys under a full moon. However, without reinforcement from outside Saigon, the situation was hopeless, and at 6:45 the next morning, Ziem ordered the Presidential Guard to surrender. 33 had been killed and 236 wounded. Entering the presidential palace, the rebels and the Americans were surprised to find Ziem and Niu gone. Ziem and Niu then left their refuge and went to Cham Tam Church, telling their driver that he should instruct General Han, the 2 Corps commander, to avenge him. At the church he phoned Lodge, who offered asylum, but stated that he would not provide transport for Ziem, and when Dunn offered to collect Ziem and Niu himself, Lodge replied that, "We just can't get that involved." Conan also telephoned the embassy early that morning. The conspirators had asked if the Americans could fly Ziem and Niu out of the country. Contrary to the offer Lodge had made Ziem when the coup was in the balance, the embassy officer explained that an aircraft could not be provided for 24 hours. Later, Lodge would remark to David Halberstam that he was relieved Ziem and Niu did not escape the coup, as otherwise their survival outside the country would have undermined the new government. Ziem then contacted the generals and offered to leave the country. An armoured personnel carrier and 2 jeeps were made ready. As they were preparing to leave, General Min gave Captain Nguyen Van Nung, his bodyguard, a pre-arranged hand signal, indicating that the No brothers were to be killed. A large crowd had gathered around the church when Ziem and Yu were taken from the church in the APC, their hands tied. The convoy drove towards Saigon, but stopped at a railroad crossing. There, Nguyen shot both men in the head with a pistol, and stabbed Yu several times with a bayonet. After this final act, the generals informed the Americans that Ziem and Yu had committed accidental suicide. President Kennedy was meeting with his senior advisors when news reached Washington of Ziem's death. General Maxwell Taylor wrote that Kennedy leapt to his feet and rushed from the room with a look of shock and dismay on his face, which I had never seen before. 2 days later, dictating a short memo, Kennedy stated that we must bear a good deal of responsibility for it, beginning with our cable of early August. Tran Van Huang, who had been imprisoned by Ziem and would be a future Prime Minister, later remarked to a British diplomat that the generals had decided to kill the No's because they knew they had neither the talent, moral virtues, or popular support to prevent Ziem and Yu from returning to power had they been sent into exile. The blame for the removal of power and murder of No Ding Ziem and his brother No Ding Yu lies with the intrigues of Lodge, with Kennedy for his failure to remove the ambassador when it became clear he was acting under his own direction, and with the State Department officials and resident journalists who had campaigned for their removal against the advice of better informed advisors in Washington and Saigon. Lodge would be reappointed ambassador by Johnson, but in August 1984, in a letter to Corliss Lamont, he admitted that "We were wrong and we failed. I should have resigned sooner." The gains the South Vietnamese military and the strategic Hamlet program had made since early 1962 were about to be reversed, and the Americans would soon have to make a difficult decision which would have far-reaching consequences for South Vietnam and the United States itself.